guard. And he's like, oh, fresh meat, all right? And so in the course of the time that he's in Rome in prison, he gets to preach the whole palace guard. This is great, doors of opportunity. Furthermore, verse 14, most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Man, the church has got it in gear. They got to step up, and they're doing it. And so this imprisonment's not nearly as bad as you think, because I've got fresh meat and they're getting bold. Now, it's true, some people are just trying to make a fool of me in my imprisonment. They're preaching out of rivalry and conceit, but I don't care what their motives are as long as Jesus is being preached. That's what he says in the paragraph starting in verse 15. And then Epaphroditus apparently asks, well, Paul, what do you think is going to happen? And Paul says, verse 19, I know that through your prayers and the help of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, this will turn out for my deliverance. Oh, Paul thinks he's going to be released. No, not quite. Deliverance, that's a word I'd want to know. It's going to turn out for my deliverance. Why didn't he say my release from prison? Why didn't he say my freedom? What does he mean, deliverance? He wants to go see. Well, let's listen to what he says. Watch this. As it is my eager expectation and hope that I will not at all be ashamed, but that with full courage, now as always, Christ will be honored in my body, whether by life or death. Paul doesn't know how this is going to turn out. He believes he will be delivered, and his prayer is that he won't be put to shame. Verse 22, if I am to live in the flesh, that means fruitful labor to me. Verse 21, if I live as Christ, if I die as gain, yet which I shall choose, I cannot tell. Does anybody have a different translation there in verse 22 at the end, where Paul says, what I shall choose, I cannot tell? I don't like the translation because in the next verse, he tells what he wants to happen. I do not know. I like that better. I should have looked at the Greek before I came, but I didn't. What? Prefer. Read it to me.
And I do not know which I prefer.
Do not know which I prefer. Well, is he a liar? Because in verse 23 he says, my desire is to depart and be with the Lord. Which is better by far, but to remain in the flesh is necessary for you. Now, the bell's going to cut me off here, and I'm not going to get to my verse in question. But if I understand that Paul is addressing a church situation where Epaphroditus has come and he's brought a gift and he's got some questions for Paul, we just want an update on your situation. And then they give Paul an update on theirs. Paul says, well, how's it going for you? And Epaphroditus says, well, it's rough. We got these two women and they're fighting about the children's education curriculum. Now, I use that as an example because everywhere I've ever been, other than here, and even if it was here, I wouldn't tell you, they've always said, you're the youth minister, help us redo the children's education curriculum. And I'm like, I ain't going to touch that with a 10-foot pole. I want you to imagine, see if you can imagine, you've got a woman who's been teaching a Sunday school class for 40 years. And she knows what she's doing. And those kids know the Bible when they get out of there. Now, she doesn't have any real training, but she's got 40 years of experience. And then you've got another young whippersnapper with a master's degree in education from Harding with specialist degree in reading. And she comes in there and she says, you're doing this all wrong, and my kid doesn't like it. And I think we need to change the entire curriculum. Well, what happens there is you've got this lady who's got experience, and she goes to her deacon or her elder that she feels close to, and she says, what are you going to do about this? And this lady over here, she's got a deacon or elder that she feels close to. What are you going to do about this? And the next thing you know, they're all posting stuff on Facebook about it. And you've got a church that's in the midst of this great conflict and tension that is paralyzing. And so Epaphroditus comes in and goes, Paul, it's a mess. We got these people fighting with each other, and people have taken sides. and we're paralyzed. And Paul says, okay, listen, before you go back, I want to write a thank you letter, and I want you to send it back. And so Paul opens the letter by calling Paul and Timothy servants. I'm convinced that no word Paul uses is wasted. Right? He doesn't just pull out his thesaurus and look to be, creative. Servant. In the prayer report, he gives thanks for their partnership in the gospel. We've been partners from the first day. Then when Epaphroditus asks him about his imprisonment, he goes, man, it's awesome. Well, Paul, shouldn't you be mad about that? I mean, you're working for Jesus, and here you are in prison. And he says, listen, it's not about me at all. It's about Jesus being proclaimed, and he's being proclaimed, man, to the prisoner and the guards and to the Roman city with the church mobilizing. It's great. Well, Paul, doesn't this make you a little bit bitter? You're going to die. Man, it's not about me. I don't care if I die. I want to go be with Jesus anyway. Unfortunately, I have the sneaking suspicion that Jesus wants me to be with you. And so Paul says there, so I guess I'll stick around. Why? Because that's what you need. I guess I'll endure this imprisonment because the gospel's being preached. At the end of chapter 1, he encourages them to live lives worthy of the gospel of Christ. And then we get to chapter 2, where he explains what that looks like. He says in the first 2 verses, if you've received anything positive from being a part of this body of Christ. Then verse 3, do nothing from rivalry or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interest of others. Now listen to that paragraph in terms of Euodia and Syntyche. Do nothing. In fact, have the mind of Jesus, who, when it came time to do what needed to be done, did not sit around talking about his education or his experience or the fact that he was God, but freely divested himself of his godness, poured it out, humbled himself, and became obedient to death. For whose sake? His sake? No, yours. Verse 19 of chapter 2, he says, that's what Timothy does. So I've got nobody like Timothy who lives like that. And then in verse 25, Epaphroditus, he lives the same way. He nearly died because of you. With all of that in your minds, now listen to these words. Therefore, my beloved brothers, if you have always obeyed, so now not only in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your own salvation in fear and trembling. That verse always scared me because I thought, well, that just means it's just between me and God. We'll just work it out. Me and God got something, we got a thing, we got an understanding. It's not what he says. What he says is the principle by which you're supposed to live is the mind of Christ, who himself, even though he was God, did nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility, he considered other people better than himself. He put their interests ahead of his own, and that's what caused him to die. There's the principle. Now, what does it look like in your life, Philippians? What would it look like in your home? What would it look like in your workplace? What would it look like in your neighborhood if everybody put everybody else's interests ahead of their own, considered other people better than themselves? What would that look like? Let me tell you what it would look like. What it would look like is that in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, you would shine like stars. Where everybody else is looking out for number one, where everybody else is climbing the ladder of success and it's dog eat dog and we don't care, to hell with everybody else. When Christians display the mind of Christ, it's refreshing. When Christians display the mind of Christ, it's illuminating. Shows a different way to live. It's not good enough for you to look at this text and go, yep, world's crooked and twisted. How is it crooked and twisted? Because everybody looks out for themselves. They love themselves as themselves, not their neighbors as themselves. They are motivated by their own sinful greeds and desires. That's what makes them crooked. That's what leads to sexual abuse. Dr. Nasser didn't care about those gymnasts, he cared about himself. Perverse, right? And so when you come in as Christians, as salt and light, displaying the mind of Christ, having a different attitude toward everybody else and everything else, you're going to shine. And now you got to do this without grumbling or complaining, right? You mean I'm going to lose again? Yes, you are. If you're fighting to be second, you won't have anybody to fight with. Nobody wants to be second, right? But that's what Paul calls us to be here. And so this call to be lights in the midst of this crooked, you can't understand what Paul is really saying unless you put it in its context. When I read that phrase in light of the rest of the book of Philippians, not only does it make more sense, it also makes direct application to my life, because that's what Paul's trying to communicate. And so he's going to go on in chapter 3, and he's going to say, now listen, but if y'all want to talk about credentials, we can do that too. If you want to talk about education and experience, I got more degrees than the thermometer, Paul says. But I very purposefully ignored all those things, and the only credential I want to show you is Jesus. And if any of you are mature, that's the way you'll handle these things. And then you can almost hear him say, Euodias and Tyche, are you listening? Take your degrees off the wall, right? One of you look at the other and say, we're going to do it your way for a little while, and then we'll try my way, and we'll see what works. If you can't figure it out among yourselves, bring in a mediator and help, and stop accusing everybody of having malicious motives. Look, if anything is pure, noble, true, think about those things. Don't get on Facebook and talk about how poor a teacher the other one is. All right, Dottie, you got a question? I'm going to let you ask it, but I'm not going to answer it. Do what?
It's not a question. I just wanted to say, if we would practice these things at home, look at what our children would be like, look at what our marriages would be like. I mean, and think of that multiplied. This amount of people, especially in my family, multiplied.
Mm-hmm.
As it goes out, we go out. We need to do this starting at home.
Right. And so what happens? You can look at that story in Philippi, the underlying fight between these two ladies, whatever it is, and what it's causing in the church and how Paul deals with it. And you can say, okay, what's the story in my church? What's the story in my home? Where does my story and the Philippian story intersect? Well, where it intersects, this is where Paul says to us, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Have the mind of Christ. Look to those for examples who have displayed the mind of Christ and work this out. Okay, we'll pick up there next week.